This community pathway is a recorded amenity, Mr. Hayes. Your fence is in violation of our access standards, and if you don't remove it voluntarily, we will have it removed for you. That was Diane Mercer, president of the Ridgeline Pines Homeowners Association, standing at the edge of my orchard on a Tuesday morning in April of 2022, clipboard pressed against her linen blazer like it was a shield. She said, "Our access standards," the way someone says a phrase they've practiced in front of a mirror. She meant it to sound official. It wasn't. What she did not know, and never bothered to find out, was that I had the recorded easement instrument for this property sitting in a manila folder in my kitchen drawer. I had read it twice the week before she showed up. The easement my father had signed in 2009 covered a narrow utility corridor along the southern edge of the parcel. Power lines, nothing else. No foot traffic, no vehicle traffic, no community pathway of any description. The document was 12 lines long and left no room for interpretation. I am Justin Hayes. I'm 51 years old. I spent 22 years as a licensed land surveyor before I retired early and came back to run my father's orchard in the hill country east of the county seat. I know what a recorded easement says and what it doesn't say. I know the difference between a utility corridor and a community amenity, and I know that one of them was filed at the county recorder's office in 2009, and the other one existed only in Diane's clipboard. So let me ask you something. If you were standing in your own orchard on land your father farmed and your grandfather cleared, and someone with a clipboard told you your fence was a violation of her access standards, what would you do? I'll tell you what I did. My father, Earl Hayes, bought this property in 1971, 11 acres of rolling ground east of the Ridge Road, planted in apple and pear trees along the flatter sections, with a woodlot at the back and a creek running the northwest corner. He farmed it until he was 73 years old, and when his hands stopped working right, he signed the deed over to me and sat on the porch and watched me learn what he already knew. He died in 2016, 3 years after my wife Carol passed from a fast illness that left me with a 16-year-old son to raise and an orchard to run alone. When my father signed that property to me, there were old stone walls along 2 sides and a post and wire fence along the other 2. And the whole 11 acres felt like the one thing in my life that was not going anywhere. In 2009, when a power company ran a new line through the county, my father signed an easement agreement, allowing them a corridor 12 feet wide along the southern fence line. The county recorded it that same year under instrument number 2009-4,417. I found the original paperwork in a shoebox in the back bedroom after he passed, and I read it, and I filed it in a labeled folder in the kitchen drawer the same afternoon. That is what you do when you are a land surveyor by training. You read the instrument and you file it, and you know what it says. For a long time, the orchard was quiet. I ran about 400 trees, a mix of Honeycrisps and Bartletts, and a row of old wine saps my father had planted before I was born. Caleb, my son, helped me with the summer thinning and the fall harvest, starting when he was 12. He learned to drive the old flatbed between the rows before he was old enough to drive on the road. The neighbors to the south were a church camp that used the property 3 weeks in summer and otherwise left the land alone. Nobody bothered us. The Ridgeline Pines subdivision went in on the property, east of mine, starting in 2018. A developer named Garrett Mercer bought a 40-acre parcel that had been a hay operation, cleared it, and built 41 houses on a looping road system with 2 cul-de-sacs. The houses sold well. By the spring of 2019, the subdivision had enough residents to organize a homeowners association, and Diane was elected president at the first board meeting by a vote of 12-7. I know because I was told later, not because I attended. I was not invited. I was not a member. My property was not inside the recorded plat of Ridgeline Pines, had never been inside the recorded plat, and predated the entire subdivision by about 47 years. None of that stopped what came next. The first time I noticed people cutting through the orchard was the summer of 2020. There was a gap in the eastern fence line where a section of post and wire had rusted through and pulled away from the corner post. 3 posts, maybe 20 feet of wire, sagging into the grass. I had meant to fix it and hadn't gotten around to it. By August, I was seeing foot traffic through the gap regularly. Residents from the subdivision taking a diagonal path across the lower orchard to reach the county trail that ran along my southern fence line. They were polite enough about it. They nodded when I was out there. A few of them said good morning. I fixed the fence in September of 2020. New posts, new wire, proper tension. Cost me a Saturday and about $400 in materials. By the following spring, the gap was back. Not because the fence failed. The wire had been pulled aside and the bottom staple on one post had been pried out. Someone had worked at it deliberately. I fixed it again in May of 2021, this time with heavier gauge wire and an extra rail, and the repair cost me another $300 and most of a Friday. That brought the total fence repair cost to $700 before Diane ever sent me a letter. The letter came in July of 2021. It was printed on Ridgeline Pines Homeowners Association letterhead, which I noticed had a small embossed logo of a pine tree in the upper corner. Diane had signed it in blue ink. The letter informed me that the pathway through my eastern fence line was an established community amenity that the residents of Ridgeline Pines had come to rely upon, and that my repeated closure of the pathway constituted interference with community access. It requested that I restore the opening in the fence and keep it clear. Going forward, there was no legal citation. There was no referenced instrument. There was no mention of any easement or right-of-way. Just the phrase, established community amenity, used twice, and a phone number to call if I had questions. I did not call the number. I set the letter on the kitchen counter and looked at it for a while. Then I went to the drawer and took out the folder with the 2009 easement and I read it again. Utility corridor, 12 feet, southern fence line, power company only. I put the letter in a new folder, labeled it with the date, and set it on the shelf next to the easement folder. I should have understood then how far Diane was willing to go. But I gave her more credit for basic curiosity than she deserved. The spring of 2022 is when things changed. In a way I could not ignore. A Thursday morning in late March, Caleb came in from doing the morning rounds and stood in the kitchen doorway with a look on his face I had not seen on him before. Not scared, exactly. More like he was waiting to see how I would react before he showed any reaction himself. "Dad," he said, "you need to come look at the east line." I set down my coffee and followed him out through the lower orchard. The trees were still bare, just starting to bud, and the ground was soft from 2 days of rain. We walked to the eastern boundary and I stopped. A 30-foot section of my fence was gone, not pulled aside, not sagging, gone. I could see the drag marks in the mud where the posts had been pulled out of the ground and dragged to the side, and I could see the tire tracks, wide and deep, from a piece of equipment heavy enough to be a small bulldozer or a skid steer with a bucket attachment. The posts were lying in the grass 20 feet inside my property line. The wire was coiled beside them, one coil, like someone had done it neatly, like they were being considerate about how they destroyed my fence. I stood there for a long moment. The air smelled like rain and turned soil, and the faint sour smell of uprooted grass. Caleb stood beside me and did not say anything, because he knew I needed a minute. The county deputy who responded to my call was a man named Torres, and he walked the scene with me and took photographs and wrote a report. He was professional and thorough and told me plainly that without a witness to the act, he could file the report as property damage and malicious mischief, but that determining who was responsible would take more. He gave me the case number before he left. That afternoon I drove to the hardware store and bought a legal pad, a pack of manila folders, and a small digital camera with a date stamp function. I already had the 2009 Easement folder. I already had the Diane letter folder. I started a new folder for the police report and photographs and Torres's case number, and I labeled it the same way I used to label field records when I was surveying, with the date and a short description. Then I went out with the camera and photographed every inch of the damage, the tire tracks, the pulled posts, the coiled wire, from 6 different angles in good light. Diane showed up that same afternoon. That was when she made the speech about the community pathway and the access standards and the voluntary removal. I let her finish. Then I said 2 things. "This is private property," I said, "and that fence is coming back up." She looked at me the way people look when they expect a door to open and it doesn't. Then she said, "We'll see about that," and walked back to her white SUV with the vanity plate that read RDGLN1 and drove away. I wrote down the time, the date, and what she said word for word on the legal pad. Then I started rebuilding the fence. Over the next several months, I learned something about Garrett Mercer that Diane had not volunteered. I found it by going to the county planning office and pulling the subdivision plat for Ridgeline Pines, which is a public document and costs nothing to view. I asked the clerk for the plat and the associated development permits, and I sat at the counter and read through them, and about 20 minutes in I found what I had started to suspect. The Ridgeline Pines subdivision had been platted, with 41 residential lots on Garrett's original 40-acre purchase. A second development phase, labeled Phase 2 on the plat, showed an additional 14 lots extending westward from the cul-de-sac at the subdivision's far end. The Phase 2 lots were laid out in a neat row, and the road access for those 14 lots was drawn as a dashed line running west from the cul-de-sac, crossing what the plat identified only as adjacent parcel, and connecting to the County Ridge Road. The adjacent parcel was my 11 acres. The dashed road line crossed directly through the gap in my eastern fence, ran diagonally through the lower orchard, and met my southern fence line within 40 feet of where the 2009 easement corridor ran. Garrett needed that cut-through to make 14 lots buildable. Those 14 lots, at the going price in that county, were worth somewhere between $2 and $3 million in developed value. The community pathway that Diane had been fighting for was not about residents taking a pleasant walk to the county trail. It was about establishing a pattern of use through my property that could later support a road access claim for her husband's expansion phase. I stood at that counter for a long time, looking at the plat. Then I photographed every relevant page with my phone, folded my notes, thanked the clerk, and drove home. I did not call Diane. I did not write a letter. I went home and put the photographs in a new folder and labeled it, and I sat at the kitchen table and thought through what the next steps were going to be. The escalation did not slow down. If anything, finding the plat made me understand that slowing down was never part of Diane's plan. In June of 2022, 3 months after the bulldozer, I received a formal notice from the Ridgeline Pines HOA informing me that I was in violation of community access standards and that a fine of $800 had been assessed against my property. The notice cited no legal authority for the fine. My property was not in the plat. My property was not subject to the HOA's covenants. I filed the notice in a folder, labeled it Incident 2, and noted the amount. In September of 2022, a man I did not recognize walked onto my property through the eastern line carrying a clipboard and wearing a vest with the word Inspector printed on the back in iron-on letters. He told me he was doing a compliance inspection on behalf of the Ridgeline Pines HOA, and that he needed to verify the fence line dimensions. I asked him to show me his county inspector credentials. He said it was an HOA inspection, not a county inspection. I told him that HOA inspectors have no authority on non-member property, and I asked him to leave. He left. I took his photograph from the porch as he walked back through the fence line and noted his vehicle plate on the legal pad. I labeled the folder Incident 3. I later found out through Torres, who ran the plate for me as a courtesy, that the man drove a vehicle registered to a property management company that shared a mailing address with Garrett's development office. By the end of 2022, the fine total in Diane's notices had climbed to $3,200 across 4 separate assessments, none of which had any legal basis. 4 folders, 4 tallied amounts, 4 dates. The 4th incident was the one that crossed the line into territory I had not anticipated. In March of 2023, I pulled up the county recorder's public search portal one evening after supper and ran my parcel number the way I do every few months out of professional habit, just to check that nothing unusual had been recorded against the property. There was a new instrument in the queue, filed 9 days earlier. It described an access easement across my eastern fence line running to the county trail, 20 feet wide for public pedestrian and vehicle use, with Ridgeline Pines HOA listed as the grantee. My signature was not on it. The grantor line had a name on it that was not mine and was not my father's. The notary acknowledgement block had a date and a seal. I printed the document and read it 3 times at the kitchen table. Caleb was doing homework across the table from me, and he looked up and said, "What is it? Something I need to take care of?" I said. He looked at the printed pages and then looked at me. He was 16, and he had watched me handle 2 years of this without raising my voice once. And he had gotten good at reading when things were serious. He said, "How bad?" "Bad enough," I said. "But we've got what we need." I put the printed instrument in a new folder. Then I got the 2009 easement folder out of the drawer and set them side by side on the table. The next morning I drove to the county recorder's office, which is in the old brick courthouse building on the main square, and I asked at the window for Roy Adkins. Roy had been the easement clerk for that county for 11 years, and I had worked with him on boundary questions when I was still surveying. He was a quiet, methodical man who wore reading glasses on a cord around his neck, and who treated every recorded instrument as though it was a legal fact until proven otherwise. I set the 2 folders on the counter and opened both of them. I started with the 2009 instrument. "Roy," I said, "what does this easement cover?" He picked it up and read it without rushing. He set it back down and said, "Utility corridor, 12 feet, southern line, power company as grantee. No other use. Authorized." "And what about this?" I set the March 2023 filing in front of him. He read it. He read it again. He set his glasses down on the counter beside the papers and looked at me over the top of the counter for a moment. And then he looked back at the document. "Who signed this as grantor?" he said. "That's what I'd like to know," I said. "This grantor name is not in your chain of title," Roy said. He opened his computer terminal and typed for 30 seconds. "This parcel has 1 recorded owner, you. Transfer from Earl Hayes, 2016. Before that, Earl Hayes from 1971. He looked at the signature block again. The name on this instrument is not yours and is not his. No, I said, it's not. And the notary acknowledgement, he said, and he picked the instrument up and looked at the seal more closely. This notary commission number? I'll need to verify this. He typed for another minute. This commission number does not correspond to an active notary registered in this state. He set the papers down flat on the counter. He looked at me steadily. Mr. Hayes, he said, this instrument appears to have been filed with a false grantor's signature and a fabricated notary acknowledgement. That is filing a false instrument with a public recorder. That is a criminal matter. I'm going to need to pull this from the active record and flag it for the county attorney's office. I'd appreciate that, I said. While Roy made his notes and began the referral process, I asked him one more thing. I asked him to pull the Ridgeline Pines subdivision plat and confirm the boundary of the HOA's covenant jurisdiction. He pulled it up on the terminal. The plat boundary ran along my eastern fence line. My parcel was not inside it. Had never been inside it. The dashed road line for Phase 2, the one I had photographed at the planning office, was visible on the plat overlay as a proposed route. Not a recorded right-of-way. Their covenants run with the lots inside this boundary, Roy said, tracing the plat edge with one finger. Your parcel is not in this boundary. Their association has no covenant authority over your land. That's what I thought, I said. Roy flagged the fraudulent instrument that morning. By the following week, the county attorney's office had opened an inquiry. By late spring of 2024, the inquiry had reached Garrett's Phase 2 development permit application, which was dependent on a recorded access route across my property. The permit was put on administrative hold, pending resolution of the fraudulent filing. 14 lots, no road access, no permit to build. Diane lost her seat on the HOA board in a special election that June. I know this because one of her former board members, a man named Phil Courtney, who lived 2 houses down from the Ridge Road, came to my fence line one Saturday morning and introduced himself and told me directly what had happened. He said the board had voted to remove her after the county attorney's inquiry became public record and that the association was formally withdrawing all access claims to my property. He said it plainly and without embarrassment, and I appreciated that. I thanked him and we shook hands across the fence. Before any of the county process concluded, I had already done what needed doing on my own land. In the winter of 2023, starting in November, I hired a fencing contractor named Dale Pruitt, who had done work for farms in the county for 30 years. We spent 3 weeks installing a full perimeter fence around all 11 acres. Heavy gauge wire on treated posts set in concrete every 8 feet, with a proper farm gate at the eastern line and a second gate at the south for equipment access. The perimeter fence cost $8,600, which I paid in full. I considered it the most straightforward money I had ever spent. Diane came to the eastern gate while Dale and his crew were still working on a Wednesday afternoon in December of 2023. She drove up in the white SUV and stood at the gate with her clipboard. She said, "You cannot close this pathway. This is a community access point, and you will be in violation of a recorded easement." I was standing about 10 feet from the gate, and Dale was standing next to his truck behind me, not pretending not to listen. "The recorded easement on this property is a utility corridor," I said. 12 feet, southern line, 2009. "I've read it. You're welcome to read it." She said, "Our attorney has filed an easement covering this access point, and it is a matter of public record." It was flagged and referred to the county attorney's office. I said. The grantor's signature was false. The notary was fabricated. She opened her mouth and then did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Our attorney will be in touch. He's welcome to call the county attorney's office," I said. She got back in the SUV and left. Dale walked up beside me and looked down the fence line and said, "You want me to go ahead and hang that gate, please," I said. On a Friday morning in late January of 2024, after the last fence section was set and the concrete had cured through 2 hard freezes, Caleb and I walked the full perimeter. He had grown 4 inches since the bulldozer tracks, and he had the same quiet, observational manner his grandfather had carried. We walked the eastern line and the southern line and the back woodlot fence, and came around to the north side near the creek. And the fence ran clean and tight, all the way around, 11 acres of it, with the gate, at the east, standing open on its hinges, waiting. We walked back to the eastern gate together. I had the padlock in my jacket pocket, a heavy brass thing I had bought at the hardware store the week before. I took it out and held it for a moment. Caleb put his hand on the gate and swung it closed. The latch dropped into the bracket with a clean, solid click. I put the shackle through the bracket ring and pressed it shut, and the lock snapped closed, and that was that. He looked at the gate for a moment. Then he looked out past the fence line at the subdivision houses in the distance, pale in the winter light. "Grandpa would have liked this fence," he said. "Yeah," I said he would have. We stood there for a little while in the cold morning air, with the bare orchard at our backs and the locked gate in front of us, and the only sound was the wind moving through the high branches. Now let me tell you the practical thing I took away from all of this, because I think it applies to anyone who owns rural property or any property at all. Read your recorded instruments, all of them. Not a summary someone hands you, not a verbal description from a title company over the phone. The actual filed document with the actual scope language. The 2009 easement that ended Diane's claim was 12 lines long. I could have read it in 4 minutes. My father signed it and filed it, and it sat in a shoebox for 7 years before I found it and put it in a folder. If I had never read it, I would not have known what it said. And if I had not known what it said, I would have been fighting a claim I could not disprove. Keep a folder. Label it. Put every letter, every notice, every fine, every photograph, every case number in it with the date on the outside. Not because you plan to go to court, because the folder is what turns your word against hers into your documented record against her false filing. And those are not the same fight. Walk your boundary lines. Know where they are. If you haven't had your corners verified in 20 years, get it done. A survey costs money. Losing access to your own land costs more. And if someone tells you your private property is their community amenity, be polite, be calm, and go read your deed before you say another word. If you've had a fence line dispute, a false easement claim, or a neighbor who confused their preferences with your property rights, I want to hear about it in the comments. Tell me what happened and how you handled it. If this story was useful to you, subscribe because I have more of them. Next time I'll tell you about a water rights claim on a creek-fed property that had been quietly diverted for 11 years before the owner found the original appropriation filing and what happened when she did. I'm Justin Hayes. Thanks for listening.